Hello and welcome to LTC Heroes Live by Experience Care. My name is Peter Murphy Lewis. I'm your host. Today I'm joined by Victoria Rama and also our guest today, Mary Newton. She is the public relations consultant at M. Newton Communications. She's based out of Madison, Georgia, just outside of Atlanta. The reason I am excited to talk to Mary today is because we met almost 2 months ago at the Georgia Healthcare Association, where she was a keynote speaker and one of my favorite talks that I went to. So much so that I went up to her right afterwards and I said, I need to have you on the podcast. One of the most viral episodes that we've had on LTC Heroes was about crisis management. And you are a crisis management expert. And I can tell by your background, you're in love with public relations. I don't know if you're in love with crisis management. I don't think anyone should be. Welcome to the program, Mary.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So we'll dive into both your professional background in PR and communications, but I'd like to get just a little bit started into what was your first day or your first week in long-term care? Take me back to that. What was your first job? What did you think about when someone reached out to you and you said, "Hey, do you want to work in long-term care?"
So it's kind of an interesting story. Technically, I got into long-term care when I was about 3 years old because my mother was a volunteer for a nursing home in Thomaston, Georgia, which is about an hour and a half south of Atlanta. And she started a kitchen band. She's a musician and started a kitchen band with the residents where they used different kitchen utensils. She would lead with guitar, and it was a big activity there. And she volunteered there for a couple of years and would bring me with her. So I was about 3 years old. So that's really technically my first entrance to long-term care. But professionally, when I was working at FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, I was looking for something else. I had been in the military, then I worked for FEMA, and I was really looking to broaden my career horizons. And I was in public relations, public affairs for the military and for the government. So I was looking for PR communications jobs. And honestly, I just stumbled across on the internet an opening at AG Roads, which is a nonprofit nursing home provider in Atlanta. They have 3 nursing homes in Metro Atlanta. And what drew me to it is not that it was nonprofit, because working in the military, working in the government, I was very mission minded with what I was doing. And so that appealed to me, that there was a mission there. And I think, so many of us have some sort of experience with a nursing home. Mine goes back to when I was 3, but, having loved ones in nursing homes. And so it just seemed like a good fit for me. And so I applied, and amazingly, because this rarely happens, right? When you apply randomly on the internet to a job, I got a call and went in and interviewed, and kind of the rest is history. And I served there for 8 years and got out last May because I was ready to take the next step of my career to start my own company. But I still consult with AG Roads, and so long-term care and nursing homes are still very near and dear to my heart.
It's funny that you mentioned that you rarely get a call, and I'm probably going to embarrass Victoria, because when Victoria applied to work, I immediately called her. I think I called her within a couple of hours, and it was the shock factor because I knew that she was going to be great to work with, and I wanted to be the first one to get a hold of her and show her that we were interested. So that's a little personal story between me and Victoria. Mary, when you joined AG Roads, what was the learning curve like for you? Is PR and communications the exact same in any organization? I would guess not.
No, but I mean, I was applying the same principles and skills. And when I joined AG Roads, I was really the first communications person they had ever hired. It's an organization that dates back to 1904, but they had never had an in-house communications person. They had sometimes an agency help with certain things, but so it was brand new to them, which was exciting for me because I got to really create my job description. And it was a big learning curve because it was even though the principles and skill set is the same. A lot of the different things I was going to be doing were different. I was kind of a one-man shop, so I had to manage all the different communications channels and even create the communications channels because We weren't on social media at that time. We didn't have a newsletter. We had a very kind of static website. So it was very exciting, and it really helped me grow professionally as a communications person to be the only person there, and I leaned on a lot of mentors, and it was the mission of long-term care, and it was nonprofit. It is nonprofit, but any long-term care, there's a mission there, right? So it's just, I felt it was very important, and it was it was something that was really meaningful to me to be working there.
And so, Mary, you were working as the chief communication officer for them while during COVID, right? Correct?
That's right. That's correct.
So, how was that experience? What did you learn from it, and how was handling a crisis like a global pandemic?
Yeah, it was challenging, extremely challenging. I came from a crisis background because I worked in the military, and then I worked for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which was literally one crisis after the other, right? So it was very challenging, but we had such a great team. And I think, fortunately, the CEO, Deep Cato, which I know has been on this podcast, and I still, I still consult with AG Road, so I'm still very close with him. He understands the value of communications and the importance of communications, especially at a time of a crisis. So I don't want to say it was easy to manage from a communications perspective, because that's not true at all. But it made it a lot more effective. Our communications were a lot more effective because we were able to get ahead of things, and the whole team could come together. We had daily calls, and everybody understood, I think, the value of getting out there, being transparent with our families. And so it was very challenging. And it still is, I know. The pace of things, the pace of the communications, and just the getting things out in a timely manner was extremely challenging, especially as things changed. But we established a pretty good rhythm, and set some frequency for our communication so that people knew what to expect. And I think that was key in managing that crisis from a communication standpoint, is just constant communication, constant outreach with our stakeholders.
Mary, I was kind of preparing for this interview, and I was thinking over your talk at the Georgia Healthcare Association, and I wanted you to kind of share some of the principles from that chat for those who weren't able to attend. One of the quotes that I found from your presentation was, "The biggest problem with a crisis may not be the incident or situation itself. Rather, it could be your response or lack thereof to the incident or situation." Can you tell me what you all did right at AG Roads during COVID, and also talk me through, like, did that question go through your mind as you were preparing the team? How do you start to, like, weigh that out, like, if your response is the right one and adequate?
Yeah. So I think, Um, and that quote, if I could revise it today, I'd say it's almost always because of your response, or it really is always because of your response. Because people understand that things happen. I mean, COVID is outside of our control, but your response to it is totally within your control. And I think one of the things that helped us at AG Roads is that our team was so in sync with each other, and operations and communications went hand in hand, because when you're dealing with crisis communications, it's not just communications, it's crisis management. It's the whole big picture. No amount of good communications can make up for bad operational decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was having that integration of communications and operations every step of the way. And then I think the value of having a communications expert, right there, is that your operations people are just in the trenches. I mean, they are dealing with so much. And so it's hard for them to sometimes see, 10 feet in front of them. And so I could I could be right there with them as they were talking through these operational decisions, and I could plug in with the input of, okay, we got to think about, once we do that, how are our employees going to respond? How are our families going to respond? Let's, before we make this decision, how about we give them a heads up? How about we put put an FAQs up on the website so that we could point them there. So it wasn't that we were, that communications was changing operational decisions, is that it was impacting, the time of those decisions and just how those decisions were communicated with all the relevant stakeholders.
Yeah, I'm sure like with COVID and everything, a lot of long-term care organizations started their like crisis plan and crisis management like strategies afterwards. What what practical advice would you give them for a successful like emergency plan?
I think it's to look at your crisis communications as part of a bigger communications plan for your organization. So instead of having a mindset of let's do this in a crisis, have the mindset of let's do this with our communications at all times. Okay. So, something at AG Roads, I mean, we were frequently communicating with families about things anyway. And so, how do we use those same best practices in communications? And, we may have to make some modifications when we're dealing with a crisis, timeliness and different, sending more things out or whatever, but it's still adopting those best practices and communications beforehand. And then it'll make dealing with a crisis so much smoother because you already have those best practices in place. And so, to give you an example, AG Roads, I feel, is a very transparent organization, and we were transparent with our families on things before COVID hit. And so we took the approach of let's not wait until we're regulated and we're forced and required to share something that we know our families are eager to get access to. For example, number of COVID cases, right? At the very beginning of COVID, organizations were hesitant or afraid to talk about that, but we took a very transparent approach. We knew that they were asking for this information. We knew they wanted to know how many COVID cases we had, and even if we had 0, they wanted to know that too. And so it's just adopting those best practices beforehand so that you're prepared for that crisis, much more effectively when it hits, because it's going to hit. It may not be COVID, hopefully it won't be COVID again, but it's going to be something.
Mary, I have kind of 2 follow-up questions. The first one being, I'm going to throw both of them out and you can tackle them in any way. If you had to hire someone new who doesn't have experience in crisis management, say you hired Victoria or you hired me today, and you had to, give us a 30-minute deep dive really quickly, like how would you do that so we understand how this is different? The normal communications are different from marketing. The second question is, do you have any examples of things where you look back and you're like, I could have done this better, or as an organization, we could have done this better, or I got it right on week 2. I wish I would have handled this on week 1. I wasn't disastrous, but I could have done it a little bit better. Feel free to handle either one of those first.
Right. So, of course, and I can't recall a specific circumstance right this minute, but of course there are things that, I wish I would have done differently. And they usually involve getting more stakeholder input, kind of when you think about communications, you have to think about it as like a plan. Who needs to be notified first, who needs to be notified second, who needs to, and it has to happen almost simultaneously, but there's still some steps. So, when I think about doing things differently, it's usually around the process of rolling something out. Could have been done, more timely or more smoothly, or involved more of the right people. And as far as, advice for maybe a newcomer to crisis, I would say that just always think through what stakeholder is this going to affect? What do we want the outcome to be with that stakeholder? And it's usually that we want them to know that we care, that we are concerned, that we're compassionate about this. You've got to put yourself in their shoes. Usually your stakeholders are going to be pretty reasonable when it comes to a crisis. So you've also got to put that kind of hat on. Don't be afraid of the unreasonable people, because usually people are reasonable. So don't let that stop you from being forthcoming and being transparent. And so I think sometimes in a crisis, people tend to want to clam up and hide and not say anything. And then that becomes its own crisis. So I think, just always considering the shoes of your stakeholders and
Mm.
putting yourself in those shoes, and then just always aligning the operations and communications. So, as a communications professional, you know, advocate to have that seat at the table for operational decisions so that you can inform those leaders. Okay, if we do this, I just want to make sure you're aware of the the perception that may give this stakeholder. So maybe we need to do some things, roll this out a little differently. Again, it doesn't necessarily change the operational decision, but it can influence it in a way that will have a better outcome with your stakeholders.
I have a follow-up question related to the person who is delivering the message. And I'm sure this probably isn't applicable to AG Rhodes because the CEO, Deke, is a very good communicator. He wrote a book about COVID and what you all went through. He's a good speaker. But maybe in your past, in one of your other jobs, how do you handle it as PR when someone might not be good at either off the cuff or coming off as human? You know that they care, but they get
Yeah.
nervous and it doesn't come off as genuine. How do you handle that with that person in the room if they don't quite trust you yet, or they think that they're better at it than they are? Have you ever had that happen? And how do you kind of explain it to them?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a tough one, especially when you're dealing with leaders, who are really, these are really smart people. They're there for a reason, but sometimes they don't always see, and I don't want to say they don't see the value of communications because that's not true, but they just, that's not their priority, right? They're not prioritizing that. And I think, um, I think it's being able to demonstrate through, um, look, I want to lay out some of the options that I think are going to happen if XYZ. The stakeholder I think will feel this way. That I mean, it's trying to show them that you have a insight into the behaviors and perceptions. That's the value you bring, is you have that insight into the behaviors and perceptions that your stakeholders are going to have. As far as, someone who's just not a strong speaker, I think training. I mean, you have to do media training. I mean, it doesn't always come natural for me. I mean, it really doesn't. I've been through a lot of media training myself. So there's no, you know, very few people are very natural at it. And even people who look natural at it have probably practiced a lot and gone
Mhm.
through training. And if you're not a little bit nervous, you're probably doing something wrong. It's good to be nervous. So I think just equipping your leaders with the training that they need, really advocating for the training, making that easy for them, doing some mock interviews and showing them, replaying, videoing it and showing them afterward and replaying, I think is helpful. Because, we have lots of examples of leaders who didn't do it well. And
Mm.
those are the ones, that's what you remember, right? So I think
I,
just really advocating to equip your leaders with the resources they need.
I have a question about stakeholders. You've used it many times. I'm guessing that there are different stakeholders depending on your care settings, depending on your region, your city, the size of your organization.
Sure.
Can you give me some examples of who are stakeholders in AG Roads? I'm guessing they're donors, the residents' family. Are there other stakeholders that I'm not
Absolutely.
thinking of?
Yes. Employees, one of the most critical stakeholders.
Hmm.
Even, even, you know, I say the public, that's too general, obviously, but in a situation where you've got a pandemic, and there was some not so great stories in the news about nursing homes and long-term care, and they bore the brunt of a lot of negative news, unfortunately. Public perception. So the public is a stakeholder because you've got to consider the perception that they have based on what they're seeing. Um, Board members if you're a nonprofit organization, or shareholders for profit publicly traded organizations. Vendors, don't forget your vendor partners. At AG Roads, we have employees, but we have vendors who manage our dietary and rehab departments, and, making sure that they're equipped with the information that they need to share with their employees. So there's a lot of different considerations when you deal with stakeholders.
Are there, I think I want to ask you, I think I want to ask you about the specific moment. I was reading an article today specifically about a woman who was the primary caretaker of her husband, who's a resident in a nursing home in New York, and she wasn't able to get in. And it was reminding me of kind of the chaos that we were going through back in March of 2020. We really didn't know what was going on. I think that we probably understood somewhere between 5 and 30%, depending on how informed we were or how busy we were. Can you take me kind of to like what that situation room looked like? Tell me, did you all jump on a Zoom? There's a lot of people who didn't know how to use Zoom in February 2020.
Yeah.
Did you all get into a room? What was the information you were getting? Where were you going to for information? Who was in that room? Can you take me to the specific setting, March in 2020?
Sure. So we, pretty immediately established a regular conference call. So we had, a conference line that we had in place. And so we pretty much set up, okay, every morning at 8:30 or whatever the time was, I can't remember. We're going to all get on this conference call and kind of everybody walk through their situation. And by everybody, I mean the administrators of the nursing home, the DONs, I was there, of course, the CEO, COO, a couple of other key staff in the homes, people who were in charge of reporting to all the various government agencies. So it was really, everybody, the kind of the key leaders and the key staff who were had to have those real-time updates, at least once a day. And so those were the key folks in the home. And, we were bombarded with communications from CDC, from, the departments of health. I mean, just, it was coming from all these regulatory bodies. And I'm sure you've heard, the nursing home industry is like one of the heaviest regulated industries. So you had to sift through all these different kind of daily, if not more, emails from each of these agencies. And from there, from those calls and, evaluating this information, we came up with different policies and procedures, and had to turn around communications really quickly. I mean, at the very beginning, we were sending daily communications out to our families. And a lot of times we didn't have a lot of information to share. But it was, that was important though, for us to continue sending that out, because especially after we had to close our doors, we knew that they were craving updates, our families were. And so it was just constantly, we pretty much set an expectation, and the team decided, we've got to say something to our families every day for a while. We kind of, we stopped that frequency after things, normalized a little bit, but just establishing that constant flow of communication, and with our employees too. I mean, that was critical. I think sometimes it's easy to overlook. You're so focused on your residents and their families, and you overlook how important it is to communicate with the staff, because who are the ones who the residents and families are calling? The staff, right? So making sure that they were equipped with all the latest information. So I think it was really just establishing that frequency of disseminating information, and constantly taking the feedback that we got, establishing a mechanism for feedback. So you could email us with questions, you could call us with questions. So we established this this mechanism for feedback, several mechanisms for feedback. We were looking at the feedback, and then in the next communication, we would address, kind of common themes that we had in the feedback. So it was, it worked out fairly well for us. Of course, you're still going to have a lot of people upset and angry, but it was, that was something we thought at least would assure our families that we cared, and that we wanted to be transparent with them.
Did you Did you lead any of those meetings or parts of those meetings? And if you did, or if you didn't, can you tell me how you go about, you as a human, how you go about filtering that information, gathering that information, and then explaining it in a succinct way? And before you answer, I kind of insinuate what I'm getting at. When I've been the PR person for either my own company or in different roles that I've played, a lot of times I will read 3 to 5 emails that I have to. Then I go speak to 2 or 3 employees, and then I usually call my mom and my dad, and I say out loud what the decision is and what I think I need to do, and they'll give me their gut reaction, and that's
Mhm.
usually the veto. What does your process look like?
Wow, that's interesting. That's a tough question. I haven't really like sat down and thought about it like that. I think, I mean, and I've said this before, so I'm kind of reiterating it, but I'm really just constantly putting myself in the shoes of that person that I'm helping craft the message for. And I also put myself in the shoes of the leaders um who are working tirelessly to answer families questions, answer staff's questions, and I'm trying to lift the burden off them some, to have a message that addresses people's questions, addresses their concern, anticipates the next question. So, I'm putting myself in the shoes of that stakeholder, and thinking through what questions are they going to have. If we tell them this, the obvious question that's going to come next is this. So let's
Mm,
go ahead and address that now. So it's just,
boom.
constantly trying to craft communications that will assure people that we're doing everything we can, and then take it a step further, address those kind of unasked questions based on
Mhm.
that. So,
I like that.
I don't know if that's really a great answer to the question, because um, maybe I've bounced a few things off my parents too. I'm not going to say I haven't.
Do
But
do you have an instance, during COVID where you knew that you had to deliver a message, either you in a press release or something to a newspaper, or preparing the CEO for, either a radio or a TV interview, that you weren't certain how it was going to be received, and you knew afterwards when you got the feedback, you're like, that was a perfect 10 dismount. It worked out way better than I thought. The people understood, we were empathetic, and we did the right thing.
I think back to some of the messages that I helped, me and Deke worked on together, that he sent out. And Deke is a very compassionate, caring person. And, I just help because he's got so many things going on. So I just help take his compassion, his what he wants to say, and, kind of formalize it a little bit. And I I think people appreciated having, not all the time, but having a message from the CEO. When we had to shut our doors, he sent out a very heartfelt message, just basically, empathizing with the families, saying, this is we are so sad to do this. This is we do not want to. It wasn't a this is what we have to do. It was this is the hardest decision we've ever had to make,
Mm,
and we are so sorry.
mm,
So I think, um you know I think those types of messages, even though they're really hard to deliver, when you're just authentic, and you're expressing more than the operational side of it. It's expressing more than this is what we have to do. It's expressing why we have to do it, and how deeply difficult, we know that is for them, and how sorry we are for them that we have to do it.
Mary, as we start to wrap up, I'm interested, now that you're independent, you have your own firm. What are long-term care organizations coming to you for? What are the specific things they want to be prepared for ahead of time? What are they coming to you right now, in terms of they come to you when it's too late and you have to help them with something that's already in process? Can you tell me a little bit about the issues right now?
Yeah, and I'll speak more broadly to organizations in general because I'm a year out in my consultancy and I work with AG Roads still, but I also work with some other organizations that are not long-term care. And I think I think they know that the time to bring an issue up is before it hits the media or before it's really public or even before any stakeholders get a hold of it. The time to address it is as soon as you get that cringy feeling of, oh man, if somebody knew about this or if somebody heard about this, regardless of if your organization did anything wrong, right? It could be a completely outside of your control. However, it's going to have an impact on those you serve, and those who put their trust in you. So I think as soon as I work with organizations to kind of, um, to kind of help them understand that as soon as you have that feeling of, oh man, this is not great, that's when you bring in the communications person. I mean, before that, I want you to bring the communications person in, but when you're dealing with a potential crisis in the making, or some sort of rumbling or tricky situation, it can save you so much grief to to address it, well before it gets to any stakeholder. And it may never, things happen all the time, and I'm not saying you have to like send out a press release or notify everybody of everything that your organization is going through, but it's good to be prepared in case you do get that call.
In terms of mistakes that you see happen frequently with crisis management or PR issues, what are some kind of low-hanging fruit that leaders can avoid right now? That if they can't afford a consultant or they don't have someone internally, hey, like here's 1 or 2 or 3 items, just don't do this and you're 50% ahead of others.
Okay, so a couple things. Don't ever make it about you. I mean, so if you're the organization going through the crisis, it's about the people the crisis is affecting. Nobody cares about you. Like it's if I'm sorry your business might lose money. I'm sorry your operations have been disrupted. But what about all the customers or stakeholders that are impacted by this? So I think when and I've seen, there's plenty of examples of leaders who have issued messages, but it's like a non-apology apology, and it's kind of like a, this has affected me, and nobody, that's bad. Don't do that. I think the timeliness of when you deliver your message is really important. So if you have a really heartfelt message, but it's 3 days after the crisis and you've let people form their own opinions and they've taken your lack of response to mean that you don't care about them and that you're only consumed with yourself. It doesn't matter how heartfelt your message is, it's too late. And so I
Hmm.
think that's definitely another one. And then also, extremely important, again, a crisis isn't a communications issue. It's, the communications issue is part of the crisis, but a crisis is an operational issue or a management issue, or it's, so when you think about crisis communications, it has to be part of the bigger picture of crisis management. And what are you going to do to fix the thing that went wrong that then caused the communications issue? So, I say communications and operations have to go hand in hand, and operations, call it what you will, programming, management, whatever, but you cannot fix a bad operational decision with communications. You just can't. You have to fix the problem.
Hmm.
So those are some key takeaways, I would say.
I have 2 last questions. And the first one, you feel free to deflect or not answer. I'm going to ask you if you have a book or a website that you would recommend that some of the audience could go out. And then the second one is, where can we find you online? I know that hopefully some of the audience will reach out to you tomorrow, and
Yeah.
not wait till they have a problem. But where's the best place to communicate and start to learn from your insight?
Sure. You can find me on LinkedIn, Mary Olsen Newton, or I have a website, mnewtoncommunications.com. Right now, I am actually reading a book, and I have to look at it to make sure I get the title right. The Agony of Decision by Helio Fred Garcia. And he is a crisis management expert, crisis communications expert. And I would recommend any leader or any leader, communications professional, anyone really interested in navigating a crisis, which should be everybody, right? um, that that book and his books are really good. He's a great, puts things in very simple, kind of common sense terms, because some of this is seemingly common sense, but it's not when you're in the middle of the crisis, right? It takes
Mhm.
time to kind of step back and evaluate what's going on. Um, so that's what I'm reading right now.
I I appreciate you joining LTC Heroes Live, Mary. It was good to meet you in person. It was great to hear your keynote, but go more in depth into the way that you approach PR and crisis management has been really insightful. Thank you so much, and look forward to maybe seeing you at the next convention.
Yes, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Talk to you soon. Look forward to connecting with you.
Thanks.